Good evening. It's not really a trivia question, but I want to ask it for a special reason. Is there life in the Canadian Senate? But first, here's Ted with the rundown.
Would you like to have your say on the 15% softwood lumber tax, but nobody's asked? Here's your chance. Beginning today, the federal government is holding a series of public hearings on the controversial Bill C67. In the studio with Webster, Chairman of the Standing Senate Committee on Banking, Trade, and Commerce, Ian Sinclair. Equal pay for work of equal value? That's the meat of Bill C62 passed late last year. Presently affecting all federally regulated businesses and crown corporations, it could soon become the norm in all Canadian workplaces. Tonight with Webster, a panel of experts examine the new employment equity program.
Ian Sinclair had a highly distinguished career as one of the top, if not the top industrialist in Canada. And then he became a senator. And he's in Vancouver now with the Standing Senate Committee on Banking, Trade and Commerce, looking at the 15% solution. And up until now, I was quite sure the 15% solution was all settled and put away to bed. Senator Sinclair, what are you doing with this? Why don't you just rubber stamp it and pass it and get it into law?
Well, Jack, if I may say so, I think that there are a lot of people learning quite a few things. That this isn't just as easy a solution as it appears. And I believe also that our negotiators have adversely affected a number of industries to a much greater extent than anybody ever realized.
You're saying that we gave away our bargaining chips, therefore, when it was indicated by Van der Zalm and by Carney, or by Van der Zalm, to put the blame where it properly belongs, that we were prepared in any case to increase stumpage because we were subsidizing our own lumber.
Well, I wouldn't say that there is a subsidy in stumpage. I think the answer to it, Jack, really is that here the province saw an opportunity to pick up some money and blame the United States.
400 million for BC.
Yes.
More or less.
Yes.
Just as crass as that, you would say.
I think so.
Well, I have been led to believe, Senator Sinclair, that due to the greediness of the lumber industry, which increased its exports of softwood in a short period from 20% to 34%, and due to the toughness of the United States in saying we're going to nail you for a 36% countervail, that we had to accept 15%.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that.
Why not?
Well, I believe that there's been a lot of misinformation going around. One of the main reasons for the increase in the percentage of exports of softwood lumber from British Columbia into the States, for instance, was due to the relative changes in the Canada-US dollar. This had a tremendous effect. Secondly, down in the States, with their way they bid up their land, they paid away too much for it, and they thought that they were going to have a continuing increase in values through the 80s from the late 70s, and that didn't happen. And so I believe there's a lot more to it than just saying that.
Well, let me use the American figures. They reckon that the cost of their lumber to the producers was about $104, where our comparative cost was less than $12 due to our system of tree farm licenses. No wonder the American producers were upset and alleging we were subsidizing our industry.
Well, you know, all I can say to you, Jack, is if there is such a tremendous ability to make money out of sawmills, I can't understand why all the British Columbia mills were doing so poorly. Mm-hmm. Now, the integrated forest companies have done rather well, mm-hmm. particularly recently. Mm-hmm. But over the last 10 years, 7 or 8 years, I haven't seen any straight lumber outfit making any massive returns that kind of a relationship would indicate.
The fact is, though, that we were led to believe that if we didn't go for the 15%, we might be hit with 36%, and that our only recourse was to G.A.T.T, complicated, couple of years, and that we would be hanging on the wire with a 36% countervail for 2 years.
Well, I don't think that's right either. I think that we could have proceeded with our G.A.T. complaint, and I think you would have had a decision likely this month or about this month. No 2 years. That was...
You're taking the industry position, of course, which was, let's go G.A.T.T. Let's not give in. We can win the countervail.
I think we could have had a good chance of winning the countervail on the basis that they couldn't prove injury. If you take a look at the figures, and Professor Haley from the University of British Columbia gave some evidence today that Oregon, for instance, last year had an outstanding year. And I don't think they could have proved that the imports were causing undue harm.
But surely the government of another country, which was hell-bent for leather on protectionism, could have, and I'm not implying venality, could have made sure that the countervail decision was 36%. I mean, that famous Packwood letter from Reagan.
They could have possibly have put in a countervail, and it could have gone to the finance, the Trade Department under 301, I suppose, and they would have found a figure. But the G.A.T.T, I think, would have found in favor of the Canadian position, and I don't think the Americans would have carried on in face of an adverse decision in G.A.T.T.
Yeah, G.A.T., General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Now, there's another point, though, which you must be concerned with in the hearings right now. The Americans give the clear impression, I've got it here somewhere, that they are entitled to monitor our entire process, to evaluate reports and interpret them unilaterally. In other words, to make sure that if we take the 15% off and put it on stumpage or other costs to the whole industry, that they have the right to veto what we do. Is that correct?
That's you're interpreting the memorandum of agreement. Yes, I would say that is correct.
Except our embassy in Washington says something different, that the Americans cannot interfere in that.
Yes, they pay a lot of attention to a release that came out of the embassy down there, but the Denison letter and the memorandum of understanding and the Denison letter interpreting it indicates the position that is going to be taken by the Americans. And it would be foolish not to recognize that.
Well, don't we lose a bit of our sovereignty, although they know all about our industry anyway? But are they going to be poking up here to say, no, you can't give this benefit to the forest industry, or we'll regard that as a breach of the 15%?
Well, after all, there is a provision in the Memorandum of Understanding that either side can cancel it in 30 days' notice. There also is a provision in there for both sides to sit down and consult every 6 months or at the request of either party. So I would hope that that's some more better, let me put it this way, some better way of handling it than just yelling and shouting is going to take place.
But you'll notice what's happened to Mac and Blow stocks, and you'll notice the profits in the pulp industry. Is there, I mean, Mac and Blow stock's up above $60 now. It's just gone up like a rocket. Do you not think that the Americans in this protectionist mood might have a go at pulp? Or what's the other thing we sent? Sulfur, potash? Are we in danger of being attacked on those grounds just now?
They're attacking potash right now. I have no doubt that the Americans will continue to attack or try to attack. I would hope, you know, that out of all this will come some realization that when governments send down good negotiators in the Department of External Affairs, they should send them down with, right at their side, industry people who understand the business. And I think we failed in having that close, cohesive way.
Well, that may have been the fault of the industry, because there was pretty raw feelings between Carney and Zimmerman throughout the entire business. I've had them both on the air about it.
Well, raw feelings should be put aside when we're dealing with something as important as this.
But you still think that we blew the bargaining chips when we indicated we're prepared to increase our stumpage?
I think so.
Free trade. I'm going to take calls to Senator Ian Sinclair, chairman of the Senate Standing Committee on Banking, Trade and Commerce. And the Senate will approve this in due course, the moment you get your report in.
We'll put a report in, but certainly the Senate will not try to stop this bill by a veto or anything like that.
After the break.
in trouble then, aren't we? If this is done.
Jack Webster doesn't quit. He's like Ian Sinclair.
Up to now, Senator, we've always had effective free trade in lumber on the West Coast. What about this leak out of Washington the other day that 10 to 12 years' time we'll have an entire free trade agreement, we'll have no protection for weakened industries, and Peterson, your Liberal friend, screams his head off. Do we want a total free trade agreement with the United States?
Even if we wanted it, Jack, the provinces wouldn't accept it. So that if Reisman and Murphy came up with that, and if the Americans accepted it, in my opinion, it would not fly in Canada.
Because of Ontario, the greediness and selfishness of central Canada.
Well, maybe not only Ontario would object, maybe Quebec would object, maybe there are other people that would object.
The people in the East realize what a disastrous state our economy is in British Columbia. Northeast coal teetering, lost 20, 30,000 high-paid union jobs, construction industry down the tube, 14% unemployment. Do people realize how bad it is here?
If they do, the government doesn't seem to have taken any action to alleviate it.
We're going to get the icebreaker if and but we will get the icebreaker. What do you think of Mulroney's government?
Well, I think he's trying hard. Mike Wilson's trying hard, accomplishing up to now rather little.
Go ahead to Senator Ian Sinclair.
I agree with Mr. Sinclair that business maybe should have been more represented in the 15% deal with the United States. Most people on the street, including me, I get so confused between industry's position declared and the government's position declared in Canada that's almost futile to understand what kind of a deal we got. But take the United States position with all their their tremendous pressures down there, lobbies and so on. And we go down there with government people. I don't think we stand a chance against that particular scene. What's your opinion about that?
Well, my own view is that the Americans were working very closely with skilled lumber people, and our negotiators should have had side by side with them throughout all the negotiations people from the industry who knew what they were talking about.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, good afternoon, sirs. I am in the lumber industry and have been for over 30 years. It seems to me that the Memorandum of Understanding, which was signed by Canada and the United States in December 30th of 1986, was something that the Canadians and the Americans could have lived with, but the Canadians have botched it.
How?
They're going by last mill rather than first mill values. The Americans were satisfied with first mill value on lumber which was being further remanufactured in British Columbia and elsewhere. I don't care about anywhere else but here. But as a remanufacturing wholesaler, you have put all the remanufacturing wholesalers and every person who owns a privately owned, independent dry kiln virtually on the verge of bankruptcy, because no one can pay the first mill price, the cartage to the resaw, the cartage to the dry kiln, the kiln drying costs, add 15% to all that, and then add some profit of some kind to that and expect to be competitive in the marketplace in the United States. It's impossible. And the Americans are quite happy with the first mill price.
Where? How about that, Senator?
I agree with them 100%. I think our negotiators, by only exempting Schedule B under the statute, have overlooked the impact on the type of work that's carried on, and it was delineated by the caller.
There's no answer now, is there?
Right. May I make a comment on that?
Just a minute. Is there an answer?
Oh, yes. I think there is an answer, whether it'll be acceptable or not to the Americans, and that is for our government to open up the agreement for consultation, which is provided for under the understanding. I understand that request has been made. The Americans have not answered, and whether they will accept going to the first mill price for the application of the 15%, I would doubt it, seeing that they've got a better deal as far as they're concerned under the existing Memorandum of Understanding.
Thank you for your call.
May I make another point, sir?
Right.
The American tariff calls it treating, and they list treating as being creosote or other wood preservatives. They make no mention anywhere in their tariff of kiln drying. And the Canadians are treating kiln drying. I've talked to your people in your excise department, external revenue, whatever you want to call it, and they think kiln drying and treating are the same thing, and they're not. And the Americans never mention kiln drying in their memorandum of understanding or in their tariff.
Well,
They talk about treated lumber, creosote, or other wood preservatives.
fair enough. That's a good point if he's right technically.
Yes?
Good. Go ahead, please.
Good afternoon, Jack. Mr. Sinclair. I just wanted to ask if you thought that the pact should have been tied in some way to the value of the $2, and whether or not that having it not being tied to the value of the $2, there might be, harmful effect of our dollar rising at all.
Well, it already has risen rather significantly. A year ago, about this time, the discount was around 40%. The discount now is about 33%. It's already moved up since December 30th by about 4 percentage points. So I certainly agree that our people that negotiated here should have had some way of relating changes in dollar relationships.
So the revenue collected stayed the same?
Relatively, yes.
Good, thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Senator Sinclair, amongst all this, don't you think something good has come out of it? In other words, the average Canadian now is thinking more of as himself of being a Canadian. He's more aware of trade. He's more aware of treaties. He's more aware of the United States takeover of Canada by financial means or insidious means, if you like. But don't you think that something has come out of it all, that it's made Canadians more aware of themselves? I'll hang up and listen. Thank you.
Well, I suppose some Canadians know a little bit more about the lumber business, but I would think that the Canadian that lost his job in treatment plants would feel very, very put out by the whole thing.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Senator Sinclair, up until last year in this province, we had something called, up until the Americans blew the whistle on it, something called the Velvet Glove and Sympathetic Management. We also had something called Section 88, which is still in place in the Forest Act, which was basically written by the forest industry. I agree with the Americans' position where basically they're looking for a level playing field. Estimates have come in that the province of British Columbia, the Crown in this case, has foregone revenues of up to $3 billion in the last 10 years because of the cozy game that's been played by the forest companies and the Social Credit Party in this province. And you should know more than anyone else, being a member of CP and a senator and sitting on boards of directors of banks, etc., in this province and country, exactly what's gone on. I'm in full agreement with what the Americans have done. They've actually finally opened the eyes of British Columbians and Canadians to exactly what's been going on with vested interest.
Okay,
right?
and to a certain extent, I back him on that because we did have sympathetic management. There was no requirement to do your full allowable cut. Section 88 was used for all kinds of things. There was nothing left to pay stumpage on.
Well, my answer to that, to the caller and to you, Jack, is if there's so much money to be made out of sawmills, why didn't you buy one instead of raising sheep or Highland cattle?
Well, all we ask is that you pay your fair share. You know,
Yeah.
the Crown is the landlord here, and the tenant's paying absolutely no rent, and the Americans just finally blew the whistle on you, and I'm in full agreement with them.
Well, all I can say is that there's a lot of people that know quite a bit about a perfect market, and a relatively perfect market in lumber has been in effect across the border, and I don't see anybody making a fortune.
Go ahead from Terrace, please.
Yes, Senator. This is a different question altogether. You're a government-elected senator. What is your views on a public-elected senator?
He's an appointed senator.
Appointed, yes.
And he was appointed by the Liberals.
Yes.
Now, what do you think of an elected Senate?
Well, I'm all for it because I have to get out of there in another year because I'm 74 and at 75 you have to retire. If I had an elected Senate, I could run and be there forever.
Give me a serious answer. Is not the politically appointed Senate a holdover from medieval days?
I don't know. I look at some of the senators there and I would think that they wouldn't be there if they had to be elected. Pretty hard for a
That just
businessman.
remind me of the Parliament in Britain.
Okay, the House of Lords in Britain. It's not quite as bad as the House of Lords, is it?
Oh,
For people going to sleep.
Well, I guess the House of Lords have done some good things too, Jack.
My thanks to, how did you get the nickname Big Julie?
Oh, I suppose that somebody thought I shot craps and they saw guys and dolls and...
Well, my thanks to you, Senator Ian Sinclair. You've got another day of hearings of your Committee on Banking, Trade and Commerce in Vancouver tomorrow, right?
And Friday morning
Tomorrow and Friday morning. Where is it? Where are they being held?
at the Hyatt Regency.
9 o'clock in the morning?
10 tomorrow.
10 tomorrow. My thanks to Senator Sinclair. Now, Employment Equity Program after the break. I'm going to start with a straight question to Walter Block, the chief economist of the Fraser Institute. Should we have in any area in our legislation the statutory requirement of equal pay for equal work for women?
Well, perhaps we could have it in the public sector. The research that the Fraser Institute has done, we've done 2 books, Discrimination, Affirmative Action, and Equal Opportunity, and this one on employment equity, which is a reply to the Abella Royal Commission report. And there we claim that there is no case whatsoever for having this legislation in the private sector, although there might be in the public sector.
In other words, you're nervous that the legislation I'm going to talk about now with Bill Rapanos, the Employment Equity Program, and Maureen Headley, you don't want ever in the private sector.
Correct.
Because it would bankrupt you.
Bankrupt me?
Bankrupt companies.
No, I don't think that's the reason.
I'm trying to get you to make extravagant statements.
Ah, well,
now,
I
Bill,
think...
we'll come to that later.
Okay.
Bill Rapanos, tell me what the Employment Equity Act, which was passed in 1986, is, because it seems to be a very powerful weapon to give women and other discriminated people a better crack at the whip.
Okay, it's set up to enhance the employment opportunities of 4 designated groups. Women are included, of course, persons with disabilities, visible minorities, and Aboriginal people. And it only affects 10% of the Canadian labor market.
Which 10%?
The 10% that's federally regulated.
That's federal government, federal crown corporations,
Correct.
and all federally regulated industries that employ more than 100 people.
Right.
And that would include?
Well, that would include
Banking?
the banks, insurance companies, media such as television, interprovincial transportation, things like that.
And what are the duties of employers under this Act to make sure of the representation in the internal workforce?
Well, if they fit the criteria, they are asked to implement an employment equity program, which means they should look at their workforce, see how these 4 designated groups are doing, and if, for instance, they don't match, say, the external labor market in certain areas, that there should be some improvement. This would mean maybe in the cases of a company, say, that doesn't have an Aboriginal person working there, that, well, maybe they should hire some. Maybe that's
In other words, you must hire the right proportion of women, Aboriginals, people with disabilities, and what's the 4th group again?
Visible minorities.
Visible minorities.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that. Is that fair?
Well, I think it's reasonably fair in the public sector.
But not in the private sector?
No, not in
Maureen
the private
Headley,
sector.
does it apply to a provincial, do we have a provincial act, because you're the staff negotiator of the BCGEU, which gives these 4 groups similar possibilities of entry and protection?
There's presently no legislation in British Columbia regarding pay equity, but I think we should all realize that since the 3 leading political parties in Canada have each adopted pay equity in their jurisdictions, the Liberals, the Tories, and the New Democrats, that pay equity is a coming thing. It may well be a requirement as a result of the charter changes. And so I think we should anticipate that there will be pay equity legislation in this province.
Pay equity legislation, who's going to... Now, is that equal pay for equal work, or is that equal pay for work of equal value?
I think the word is used to describe either one or the other.
Is that a good thing?
Well, not in the private sector. I think that with regard to the private sector, I hate to sound like a parrot here.
No, you got to. Because you once said that women are paid 65% as much as men because they are only 65% as productive as men.
Yes, I think that that's roughly correct. You see, the usual view is that women are paid 65% as much as men, and they're equally productive as men. And I think that that view is economically untenable. It just can't wash, because if it were true, suppose you have a man and a woman right here before you, and you're an employer, and they're equally productive, and let's say that they're productive at the rate of $10 an hour, and this man you'll have to pay $10 an hour, and this woman you'll only have to pay $6.50 per hour. Well, is there any doubt that if you've got any modicum of sense that you'll hire the woman, because you can make $3 an hour, $3.50 an hour profit off of her? And if you don't have any good sense, if you're a sexist, racist pig or whatever it is, and you hire the man, well, someone else will hire this woman and drive you bankrupt because you're hiring more expensive workers.
These economic theories that Walter keeps repeating, or the economic basis for doing something, I mean, the Americans tried slavery for 300 years, and that was strictly based on economics. I mean, why would we want to pay somebody less if the climate that we're in, if the community we're in is to try and cooperate and improve things for people?
What is the difference in male and female earnings, say, in your field?
Well, just to show that Walter's statistics are either inadequate or just incorrect, in the public sector, the wage gap between average female worker is in fact 75 cents to the dollar that a male worker in the public sector earns. In the private sector, it's 64 cents for the female worker as opposed to the dollar that the male worker earns. So we have been more successful in the public sector in negotiating higher rates for women, slightly higher rates for women. But the argument is still there that pay equity legislation is necessary, but it's necessary in both sectors, both public and private sector.
Now, your Employment Equity Act rose out of the Abella Royal Commission, did it not?
That was the government's response to the Abella Commission, and they also did a companion initiative, the Federal Contractors Program. Same criteria, 100 or more employees. If you were bidding on federal goods or services or supplying federal goods or services, you must implement employment equity. The difference between, say, a federal contractor and a company under federal jurisdiction is that the companies under federal jurisdiction must report annually. Somebody who's a federal contractor or a company that's in that ball game, they are monitored after they get a contract.
Now, is this now in effect now in the federal government?
Yes, it is.
Is it working?
Well, I mean, it's pretty hard to tell. Many companies have started the first steps to implement employment equity.
Including the federal government itself.
Pardon?
The federal government itself.
Yes, the federal government itself.
Employment equity. What happens, this might interest, although Walter knows this, what's the fine, the maximum fine, if I fail to carry out the provisions of the Employment Equity Program?
Well, if you fail to report and refuse to report for your company, the fine is $50,000. Nobody's been fined yet.
Anybody been charged yet?
No, nobody's been charged yet.
What does it mean, though, the internal workforce? Does that mean I must go through my labor force and say, okay, I'm not properly representing these 4 special groups, women, etc.? Do I have to hire that proportion within a certain time?
I don't think the government's intention is that somebody must follow some strict mathematical quota or anything like that, just to show improvement. For instance, when the Federal Contractors Program is being monitored by people from NHQ, they will be looking for some improvement. For instance, if they didn't have any Native people working in their organization, and they've hired 2 or 3, I mean, that's a plus sign as far as the government's concerned.
Is this affirmative action being thrust upon the taxpayer unnecessarily?
Well, I think it's unnecessary, and I think it's a moral disaster. There was this magnificent case in New York City where this person who was blonde and blue-eyed, and they had an affirmative action for the police force for black people, and he said he was a black person, and therefore he should be allowed in under the black whatever. And you know, there's one country in the world today that is expert in determining whether a person is black or white. I don't know, you look behind their ears or up their nostrils or something. It's pretty morally repugnant. And that, of course, is South Africa. And I think that these quotas and $50,000 fines are just an infringement upon people's rights to associate with whomever they please. Plus, I think it's just economically speaking illiterate and nonsensical. You see, it's predicated on the idea that somehow men and women have equal productivity and therefore should be paid the same. But if you take the ratio of earnings of unmarried men to married men, you get roughly the same 65% ratio. If you take the earnings of young people to people in their 30s and 40s, you get again roughly the same ratio. And no one says that this is due to discrimination. This is due to unequal productivity. And it will boomerang. It will have very serious negative and unintended effects. Because look, suppose you insist that a woman who is only worth $6.50 an hour be paid $10 an hour. What you'll have is an effect similar to the minimum wage law, where women are booted out, in effect, overpriced, priced out of the market, and the unemployment rates for women will skyrocket.
Yeah, I think that we spend too much time talking about women in the labor market. There
Hold
are
it.
four
We'll come
designated
back.
groups.
2 points when we come back after the group, and one is that he seems to give me the impression that women always are less productive than men, and you want to spend some time on the other groups. After the break. I'm going to go to Maureen Headley from the BCGEU. Walter gives a clear impression that women are less productive than men on all occasions and therefore should get less money ipso facto quod erat demonstrandum, doesn't he?
Walter does do that, but Walter's wrong. I think the question we should be discussing is whether as a society, as a group of people, we want to do something about discrimination. That's discrimination against women, handicapped people, the underprivileged. And I think as a society, we should and we must. And I think the governments in this country have decided that it's time to do something about that. I think that what we should do is quit blaming the victims, which is what Walter is doing. He's saying it's women's fault. It's not their fault. The problems are inherent in society, and as a society, we've got an obligation to do something about it.
But isn't it very difficult in these rough economic times to implement your specific programs for implementation of visible minorities and the other three groups?
Tell you a short story. We were going around seeing employers on the voluntary program before any legislation, and employers were saying to us, look, we're so busy, would you please come around when we're not quite as busy, and we'd be delighted to talk about affirmative action employment equity. So the recession hit us. We were still going around seeing employers promoting what we're promoting, which is equity. And they said, look, we don't have any economic prospects in the future. I mean, times are tough. We're laying people off. So I say to them when I hear that, well, when is the right time for equity? I mean, if you believe in this kind of a principle, you know, when is the right time for it?
When is the right time for equity?
Well, I'd like to reply to the statement that you started with. I would say there is never any right time for coerced, legalized, or equity at the barrel of a gun, or, you know, with a $50,000 fine. But the point is, you see, you're saying that I'm implying that women are less productive, and that's not true. And Maureen is saying that there is discrimination against women, and I don't see that in the private sector. Now, what the Fraser Institute did in response to Judge Abella's report is we looked not at all men and all women, but we looked at the segments of men and women that we thought would have equal productivity, namely men and women who have never been married, because marriage has an asymmetrical effect on male and female incomes. It enhances male incomes and reduces female incomes because of unequal sharing of house care and child care.
Is that discrimination?
Well, I don't think it's discrimination. It's a voluntary agreement. But the point is, what we did is we took certain segments of the society that have never been married, and we got wage ratios between men and women that were roughly 0.9 to 1.1, namely, women earn virtually the same thing as men do when we have reason to believe that their productivity is the same. For example, men and women with a university degree in '82, women earn 93% as much as men. With a post-secondary certificate or a diploma or a university degree, women earn 109.8% as much as men. Namely, women earn more than men.
That's so the new affirmative action, though, isn't it?
No. This is before affirmative action. This was in 1971. The point is that women and men earn the same when they have the same productivity. When they have very different productivity, they earn very different amounts.
I thought women were in clerical ghettos. I thought that was one of the real complaints.
That's the point that Walter's analysis misses. That analysis based on marriage is just nonsense. Women do have children. That's a biological fact. But that is no reason to pay them less money for what they do. Women's work has value. The problem in this society is women's work is undervalued. And you hit the nail on the head, Jack, when you said women are in clerical ghettos. That work is undervalued. That's the work that should be.
Now, I know very little about this, but just try and stay with me for a minute. Equal work for equal pay, I can understand. Walter and I are doing the same job at the same machine, be we male or female, and we get the same pay.
Yes.
Right. Equal pay for work of equal value. That was equal work for equal pay. Now, equal pay for work of equal value. Does that not mean that I, the office supervisor, should be making as much as the truck driver who's picking up $50,000 a year? The woman in the office.
Maybe.
Is that what it means? Is that what it means?
Well, yes, there is a difference. That's what it means. It means the outside worker or the secretary of the mayor, that there should be a look at what is required in education, training, experience, the machines to operate.
And maybe on that basis, the woman in the office, even if she's not the boss or near the boss, might get more than the truck driver.
Perhaps.
This is the most insane, idiotic law that's ever been perpetrated on a gullible Canadian public. This is just absolute nonsense. What they do is they assign points on an arbitrary basis to what they think is skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Now look, suppose I fire an arrow up a quarter of a mile in the air, and as the arrow comes down, I try to catch it with my teeth. Now, this is very skillful. This takes great effort and responsibility, and the working conditions are abysmal, because if I miss and the arrow goes through my ear, I'm in trouble. Now, according to a point assignment, I should be paid $1 million a year for that. The point is, though, the difficulty with this view is that no one wants to watch this. So this salary, this kind of labor earns zero. Take the horse and buggy industry after the advent of the automobile. The same skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions, and yet those jobs are worthless. This thing has got nothing to do with economic reality.
I hope I'm not getting lost here.
No, you're not getting lost. But before we even get to this business of equal pay for work of equal value, and by the way, it is the law in Canada. Okay, it is the law.
For everybody.
It's in the law for the federal jurisdiction.
Well, again, federal jurisdiction.
Federal jurisdiction. Okay, but I just want to mention something about the attitudes of employers. And we've visited about 500 employers since 1979 in British Columbia, let alone the rest of Canada. And employers said to us, look, you know, usually as we were walking out, they're escorting us out. I believe in this. We think this is a good idea, but you know, it'll never fly until there's legislation. The Council of Employers, BC Business Council now, in 1982 they did an 18-month study on affirmative action employment equity. What were their recommendations at the end of that study? To their members they said, please do something voluntarily to improve the equity position of the persons with disabilities and for women and for Native people, because if you don't, somebody's going to hit you over the head.
And that is a necessary move, is it not, to avoid the appearance and factual discrimination against underprivileged groups?
There is no evidence whatsoever that there's any discrimination. I mean, this whole argument is predicated on the fact that there is some, and yet I've yet to see any shred of proof or indication or evidence that there is. All they do is they cite unequal earnings. But unequal earnings, on average, can easily be explained by different socialization practices. Why there are women on record as refusing wage increases and promotions on the grounds that this would put at risk their relationship with their husbands or their boyfriends.
Do you believe that, Maureen?
What nonsense. I can't believe this. Walter's position is purely a political position, and I think it's important to realize that. We're not talking economics, we're not talking studies, we're not talking research. It's a political ideology. And that's where the difference is. And I think we have to make a choice. Politically, I'm not prepared to live in a society that discriminates against people. And I think that's a choice we have to make. Are we prepared to live in a sexist society?
Hold your breath. We're going to take some phone calls to Walter Block, the Fraser Institute, Bill Rapanos of the Employment Equity Program of the federal government, Maureen Headley, staff negotiator for BCGEU, after the break. While the government talks about freeing up gambling laws even more, I talk to people that have suffered most from gambling, the members of Gamblers Anonymous. What gambling's done to their life. While the government talks about freeing up gambling laws even more, I talk to people that have suffered most from gambling, the members of Gamblers Anonymous. What gambling's done to their lives. That story tomorrow on Webster at 5 p.m. precisely. We're talking about the federal government employment equity program, which I didn't really know existed, which affects 10% of all people who work under federal regulation, and which says you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to have equal pay for work of equal value, and you've got to give preference, correct, Bill Rapanos, to women, aboriginals, I hate that word, disabled people, and visible minorities. You must. There's no jail term if you don't, is there?
You have to provide opportunities, not necessarily preference.
You've got to give them a chance, in other words.
That's right.
And that's preference, isn't it?
Well, I think that the profit incentives of entrepreneurs and employers is to give everyone a chance because you can make profit from hiring people.
As cheaply as you can.
Of course, as cheaply as you can. That's the market system. When you go to the supermarket, don't you try to buy as cheaply as you can?
We have not yet got this provincially.
We don't have it provincially.
But you have negotiated quite a few of the aspects of this, have you not?
We've been trying to achieve equality for women since 1975.
Okay, well, just before I go to the phones, equal pay for work of equal value is the law for everybody in this country.
Under federal jurisdiction.
Under the 10% of the people
in
federal
jurisdiction.
That'll come one day, won't it? Eh?
Probably. If these people have their way, yes.
If you have your way?
No.
Hey, wrong one. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Jack. I'm a white male in my late 20s, and I have grown up in Vancouver all my life. I seem to get the feeling that all they're talking about is the white employer discriminating against the East Indians or the Chinese or the BC Indians. But I think if you go around to the schools these days and you look in the schools, you will see who obviously is the minority. It is the white people. And could they not talk about the East Indian employer not hiring the white people, which never happens?
That's a fair question.
You know, you can go to a mill, which is in Vancouver, and you go in the mill, you walk in, you might see 2% white people, and all the rest are East Indians or Chinese.
You feel like you're telling me like a visible minority in specific occasions in specific places?
Well, I looked at my school the other day. I went back for my reunion.
Okay, I don't need any more details than that. How would you respond to that kind of touchy question?
For instance, we've had employers that say, well, we've never even had a Native person come and apply for a job. So all we did was just simply set up some referrals so that they could interview some Native people. That particular company had, and by the way, they said the same thing about persons with disabilities. And within about 8 weeks, they had 12 Native people working in their company, and they had 3 persons with disabilities.
Well, that's fair, isn't it? Let's try another call. Go ahead, please.
Hello there?
Yes.
Yeah, I have to agree with the gentleman from the Fraser Institute. I can see why he's shaking his head in frustration at some of the comments there. I think women and men are paid the same. What happens, though, is that most men go to university, they get well educated, they're ambitious, they want power, they take on a lot of responsibility, thus they get paid more. Women, not all women, but an awful lot, are quite happy being waitresses and secretaries. Do you pay a chief executive officer the same as a secretary?
Maureen?
Thank you very much.
That's just not supported by the facts. Women in this society pay mortgages, they're single parents, they're paying the rent, they're looking after feeding their kids. Women are concerned and deserve equal pay for the work they do. Yeah, and that's what we're talking about.
You can see a big change, too, in the presence in various important positions of 25 times as many women as there were 10 years ago.
Well, I think that this gentleman's, the caller's point is supported by the facts. The facts, as reported by Statistics Canada, they did a special survey for us. You see, they don't even count never married people. But we made a special deal with them where they counted this for the first time, and we found that when you take women who have never had children or never been married and never been subject to the unequal treatment of marriage, that their incomes are virtually indistinguishable from those of men.
They can do very well, thank you very much, if they stay single and concentrate on their career.
No, if they have the high productivity. The key is the productivity. And you see, we have this unspoken premise that there is some discrimination, and this has not been proven. We hear exhortations to get rid of the discrimination, but the point is that in the free enterprise system, there is a profit incentive to get rid of discrimination.
But there has been discrimination, though. I mean,
Well,
in the federal
yes.
government, for instance.
Even in the American system, when the Americans put affirmative action in 20 years ago, I mean, they started out feeling, that is the bureaucrats, that employers were evilly motivated, and that's why this was happening. There were no blacks working in this plant, etc. They quickly disabused themselves of that and realized it was a systemic problem.
In the system.
And I would agree with Walter that a heck of a lot of acculturation and traditions and values that we've had have contributed to where we're at. It's a changing world, though, and everybody's out of step except Walter and his cohorts.
Well, I'm a wee bit out of step myself. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to make two comments. First of all, it's nice to have you at the 5 o'clock time slot because I get to watch you more often. The second comment is I'm absolutely outraged by the gentleman from the Fraser Institute. I mean, his way of thinking is so archaic and backwards. I mean, it's, you know, and there's just one other point that I want to make. Women are not the minority. Women are the majority. And really, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. You're archaic, Walter. Don't forget that.
Could I just say that if the people in the listening audience would like to get some free information about this archaic study, they could write to me at the Fraser Institute, 626 Butte Street, Vancouver, British Columbia, V6E 3M1, and we will send you some free information describing the archaic and idiotic research that we've been doing.
Jack, and further, if they want to get the study that rebukes Walter in its entirety, they can write to Labour Canada. It's discussion paper 6, where they destroy his arguments.
Good. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Webster, I'd like to make a few points. First of all, I think it's the two representatives, one from the BCGEU and the other from Employment Equity, that are the real political ideologues in this discussion. They are socialists to the core because they believe the government could at some point enforce wage rates on other industries. I think Mr. Block is quite correct in his view that there really is very little discrimination out there, and the marketplace is much better at deciding what rate people get paid than the government is. My last point is that the one article that I think the two people from government should read, and yourself, is an article by Conrad Wynne in Canadian Public Policy called Affirmative Action. And in that article, he destroys the 8 fallacies of affirmative action. Goes the whole way through, Stats Canada reports the works, and destroys the argument of people who support employment equity. And it is not supported by the Canadian people, Mr. Rapanos, because somehow we will get through to our government that government cannot enforce wage rates on the
private sector. One last call. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Jack, I think Walter's an absolute certified loon, actually. And besides that, he keeps on quoting from 1971 book that he's got there. And I fail to see what the Fraser Institute has contributed to anything. And I'll just hang up and listen to your answer.
And they will leave it at that. You won't have time to answer.
Well, let me just say it's a 1985 book.
You've been officially christened a loon, and you're officially christened socialist ideologues. But I'm grateful. I've learned quite a bit tonight about the employment equity, a guide for employers, and all the things in it. My thanks to you, Mr. Rapanos, to you, Maureen Headley, and to you, Walter Block of the Fraser Institute. And I'll be back after the break. While the government talks about freeing up gambling laws even more, I talk to people that have suffered most from gambling, the members of Gamblers Anonymous. What gambling's done to their lives. That story tomorrow on Webster at 5 p.m. precisely. One thing social credit promises are many more opportunities to gamble in casinos. I don't like the idea, so I've done a little bit of a feature which I'm going to run tomorrow night with Gamblers Anonymous. Yeah, I think you'll find it quite interesting. 5 p.m. precisely. That wasn't too bad. Okay, then.